Nikon Z6ii batteries are tested to go for up to 410 shots. So is it possible to shoot for up to 6 times that amount? I'm going to answer that question right now. But spoiler alert, the answer is yes. The purpose of this video is to describe what I think is an unusual experience while shooting my Nikon Z6ii at a fashion show photo shoot. One weekend last month in Waikiki, there was a Saturday fashion show. I bought a ticket and showed up with my camera, which was a Nikon Z6ii and adapted 85 1.4G lens. I didn't know anything about the lighting, the size of the venue, or the rest of the setup. I first wanted to say, before I go further, that I have an incredible amount of respect for the models who participated in this event. They're clearly a lot braver than I am, as it doesn't take any courage whatsoever to stand off to the side taking pictures. But it does take a lot of courage to put on different outfits and walk out in front of people that you don't know in a poorly lit environment. And so my intention in making this video was to discuss what I thought was a markedly extended battery life that I had during the shoot. And I tried to include what I considered to be the best photos of the models. And I'm not here to rate or rank the models, as in my opinion, they all did an awesome job. I also wanted to say I can't overstate how dark it was during the shoot. It was very, very dark. In fact, there was a third photographer standing next to me who was using, I think, a kit lens. And I haven't seen any of those pictures posted anywhere except for a couple of flashed images, as the unflashed images I think are probably unusable. In terms of my background, while I mostly do landscapes and portraits, I do have some experience shooting a couple of fashion shows in the past. In those cases, I had used a 24-70 2.8 Tamron lens on a Nikon D750. From those experiences, I was thinking that I wanted to let in more light than just what the 2.8 lens offered to get a better shutter speed. And I took a chance on bringing the 85 1.4 lens with me. As it turned out, based on where I was standing and the size of the venue, 85mm was about the perfect focal length. I think 135 would have been too long and 35 would have been too wide. I had my ISO set up to auto and I had it to top out at 12,800, and I had my minimum shutter speed at 1/100th of a second. I think in the future at an equivalently dark venue and standing relatively close to the models, I would have opted for a higher minimum shutter speed of 1/125th or 1/160th. Even so, I think I did manage to take a number of usable images. This is just an educated opinion, but I think that at a larger venue, the 85 would not have been the right focal length. I have shot a fair amount indoors, and there are times when even the holy trinity of 2.8 lenses is not sufficient aperture for taking the best quality images. And I think in those cases, you can't substitute for a prime lens that opens up below an aperture of f1.8. So before getting further into my discussion, I just wanted to give you my settings. I was shooting in full RAW at aperture priority at f1.4. I was using continuous back button autofocus with center weighted metering. My focus mode was human eye autofocus. And I mentioned this earlier, but my minimum shutter speed was 1/100th of a second, and the maximum ISO using auto ISO was 12,800. I did most of my shooting using the rear screen, not the viewfinder. And I was in continuous high shutter mode, which on the Nikon Z6 yields about 14 frames per second with raw images. I wanted to just run through a couple things that made the shoot somewhat difficult. The first was that it was dark. The second was that the lighting was strange and it was changing. And the third is that the subjects were moving, and even though I was stationary, I was turning the camera to match the walking paces of the models walking down the runway. And so, to kind of expand a little bit on the idea that it was dark in there, other than the obvious possible problems with noise that you might encounter, I did find that some of the models tended to walk much faster towards the camera, and even with continuous autofocus, I ended up needing to take my finger off the autofocus button and replace it relatively often to refocus and help counter the speed that the models were walking. The more experienced models tended to walk slower down the carpet and to pause for just a little bit in front of the primary photographer. That added time in combination with slower movements created a situation where I found that I was more likely to get more in focus pictures with the more experienced models. Now, you might be saying probably a better choice would have been to use my Nikon Z8 with a stacked sensor, and you'd probably be right. But I have a lot of experience now with the Nikon Z6ii, and before that with the low light performance of the D750. And I opted to go for lower frames per second in favor of possibly better higher ISO performance, a larger pixel pitch, smaller file sizes, even in spite of the Z8 having a stacked sensor and markedly improved autofocus over the Z6ii. It was only after culling and editing a lot of the images I started to become curious about what the ISO was that most of my pictures were taken at. So using the metadata, I plotted out a bell curve of the number of images taken at each ISO. So I created a graph, and the x-axis is the ISO and the y-axis is the number of images taken. The bell curve center trends to center right around ISO 6400, which, in my opinion, with an aperture of 1.4 is very dark. And while it's not directly comparable, this is around the type of ISO I would use for Milky Way photography, and normally I would never consider photographing people at this ISO. One downside though, if I was using a higher shutter speed like 1/125th, 1/60th, 1/200th, the average ISO would likely have been in the 7,000 or 8,000s or even higher. And even with AI noise reduction, you can start to see some image degradation at those higher ISOs. And some of my images, you may be able to see, some motion blur in those. I tried to throw out the images that had the highest amount of blur, and I think that the ones that I kept would still be usable for things like social media or smaller prints. The second thing I wanted to just expand on was the weird or bad lighting. The lighting pattern would change after each model, and in some of the images the model would have a green or a red splotch of light on their face. I think the lighting that they were using was an LED, and I found it difficult to edit the images in a natural way. For me, the best fix that I found was to sort of desaturate some of the images, pull the saturation down a little bit, and that neutralized some of that artificial lighting artifact, but it didn't work in every case, and so I ended up throwing some of those pictures out. The primary photographer, who was standing to my right, used flash maybe twice during the evening, and I ended up getting a single exposure during one of those flash durations. And in my opinion, the light on the model was very flat. I don't think it would have been possible to flash the entire show. Probably better would have to have some kind of continuous light off maybe 45 degrees to the stage. And then the third thing I wanted to expand on were moving subjects walking directly towards the camera. I would say some of the motion blur I was getting was related to me. As they were walking down the runway, I was turning the camera to match their pace. And I can't discount the fact that this probably introduced some motion blur to the images. And I'm not a perfect photographer when it comes to panning. Because of my position on the floor, it wasn't practical to have a monopod. In another shoot, or if I was the primary photographer, I might consider using a monopod. But even that wouldn't be perfectly ideal, because switching from landscape to portrait mode, at least with the prime lens that I was using, would have been more difficult. What was exceptional to me, after I got home and culled several hundred blurry photos out of the images, I ended up realizing how many pictures I actually ended up taking on a single battery. My typical style of shooting is normally I shoot landscapes or portraits, so I only have one battery for each camera. I never run through a full battery, even after shooting upwards of 400 photos in the past, and so I have one battery per camera. I don't shoot weddings or anything like that where you would need multiple batteries. I was able to calculate that I had taken almost 2,500 images. The exact number was 2,425 on a single charge. And I remember after this looking at the camera at the end of the shoot, and I still had 4 bars remaining. And I can only come up with 2 possible explanations on why this might have been possible. The first reason was that I was doing multiple rounds of burst shooting for each model, and I wasn't chimping between individual photos. I think that this lessened battery consumption would have been used during a slower shoot to power the rear screen for photo reviews. And by not reviewing each photo, I ended up conserving some of the battery life. The second reason, and I don't really have any way of knowing how much effect this had, but in a normal situation, I would charge a battery for an hour to an hour and a half, and I would set an alarm, and when the battery charger was done, I would take the battery off that day. In this instant, the night before the shoot, I had put the battery in the charger and I fell asleep. And so the battery was in the charger all night long. I don't know how much this may have helped the battery, is that in cases where I forget my iPhone in the charger all night, the battery seems to lose charge very quickly, and I actually can't charge my phone to 100% after that for a long time. So I can't say that the batteries behave the same, but I can't say that leaving it in the charger all night was the reason that I got so many photos. It may have helped. Well, alright, I hope you guys thought this video was at least interesting. I tend to ramble on a little bit. I'm relatively low drama and I have a difficult time making funny videos, but if you did like or learn anything in this video, please like and subscribe. I'm trying to grow the channel. I hope to post regularly photography videos from the sunny island of Oahu. Cheers!